have. This,
well,
I have no more.
Since you're only going to say it once, let us just get it set up.
Sorry?
Just we're here. Let me just ask you something.
I have no, I cannot answer your question. I told you, I repeat it again, the game is over. I hope the peace will prevail, and with the Iraqi people, at the end of the day, will have a peaceful life.
What do you mean that the game is over, sir?
The war, I mean.
So you're convinced the war is over?
Yeah.
What is the situation with Saddam Hussein?
Well, I don't know. This is perhaps the American knows. I have no relationship with Saddam, so I can't tell you. I am here like you.
Explain to me, sir, what do you mean you have no relationship with Saddam? What does that mean?
No, I have no communication with Iraq. I am here, so I know nothing about what is going there.
What do you make, sir, of the pictures you've seen of?
Well, despite the developments in Iraq, in Washington, the operative word is still caution. U.S. officials say they welcome the events in Baghdad, but there is no jubilation. John King reports.
A powerful snapshot, but with the celebration came a challenge for a White House determined to make clear down does not mean out, and that the war is hardly over.
There may well be hard fighting yet ahead. Regime forces are still in control in northern Iraq, in Mosul and Kirkuk and Tikrit.
Yet with the caution came a small dose of "we told you so."
In the early days of the war, the plan was criticized by some retired military officers embedded in TV studios. But with every day and every advance by our coalition forces, the wisdom of that plan becomes more apparent.
As the troops press on, the administration is accelerating planning for post-war Iraq. Retired Army General Jay Garner leads the civil authority that will move in soon and run key services until power can be handed over to a new interim Iraqi authority. The administration blueprint still has no firm timetable for getting the interim authority up and running, but planning meetings in southern Iraq will begin as early as next week, involving a mix of indigenous Iraqis and exiles and dissidents now returning home, with General Tommy Franks in charge of the invitations. The hope is with Saddam Hussein out of the picture, local leaders will naturally emerge to help shape the new authority.
The president has very high levels of faith in the ability of the Iraqi people to govern themselves and make these decisions for themselves.
Iraqi National Congress leader Ahmed Chalabi is a favorite of many top Bush advisors and will be among those invited to post-war planning sessions. But his complaints that the administration is moving too slowly with reconstruction efforts have annoyed even some of his top administration supporters. And officials stress he is but one of many voices in the post-war political debate. The president watched some of the celebrations in the streets of Baghdad, and while obviously pleased, he told top aides it is not yet time to declare victory. Behind the scenes, a palpable sense of vindication, but the public watchword from here will be caution for some time to come. John King, CNN, the White House.
Well, from politics to editorial opinion, let's get a check now on how some of Europe's newspapers have reacted to the apparent fall of Saddam Hussein's regime. France's La Libération says the successful military campaign in Iraq can only reassure the powerful United States that its vision of the world must be the right one. But its pretext for invading Iraq is being proved wrong. For where are the weapons of mass destruction? Italy's La Repubblica newspaper has this editorial: before victory has been declared, before peace has been proclaimed in Iraq, a new war has started at the UN. The battle lines are drawn, and this time the countries that oppose the coalition war are ready to muscle in and demand a piece of the Iraqi pie. And Spain's El País says this warning: the Arab population will be watching the US performance after the war. Their behavior and success in Iraq can either reassure or inflame further the mood in the Middle Eastern region.
Okay, some reaction from editorials in papers around the world. Let's get to Damascus in Syria now, where our Sheila McVicker is standing by with reaction from there to the latest scenes and the developments in Iraq and indeed in Baghdad over the past 24 hours. Sheila.
Hello, good morning. Yes, indeed. Well, here in the Syrian capital, it's a very different picture than we have been seeing from those scenes of jubilation in Baghdad. Syrians are very wary, very suspicious of what has taken place. A number of the newspaper headlines published both here in Damascus and in Beirut this morning suggest that there must have been some kind of conspiracy for Saddam Hussein's forces to have disappeared so quickly. A deal, they suggest, perhaps with the Russians. The picture that is playing most prominently in the newspapers this morning is that photograph of the U.S. soldier putting the American flag over the face of Saddam Hussein yesterday. An image which lasted only for a very few seconds, but an image which resonates very deeply here, because that is the image which people here fear most, an image not of liberation but occupation, and that's what people are seeing and fearing very much. Becky?
Have we had an official reaction from the Syrian president?
In speaking yesterday to senior Syrian officials, what they have said again yesterday is what they have said all along. They have opposed this war not because they are friends of Saddam Hussein, and indeed there is a long history of enmity between the Syrian Ba'ath Party and the Iraqi Ba'ath Party, a history that goes back more than 20 years, but because they feared for Iraq's people. There is another reason as well. It is not just what happens in Iraq, but it is also what happens here in Syria. We heard the U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld talking again last night about allegations that Syria was continuing to ship military equipment across its border into Iraq, allegations that some former members of the Iraqi regime or their supporters were finding shelter here in Syria. So the Syrian officials are very wary of what U.S. intentions in the region are, and they want to know whether they are indeed next on the U.S. agenda. Becky?
What can you expect next then from Syria, their attitude towards what's going on at present and going forward? You say they're concerned about what the U.S. might do next so far as Syria is concerned. How will they cope?
I couldn't quite catch all of that question, Becky, but let me say this, that there are a number of concerns in the region. It is, as I said, this continuing and increasing pressure from the U.S. on the Syrian government, a feeling that the U.S. has other targets in its sights, perhaps the terrorist group Hezbollah, which of course falls under some degree of Syrian and Iranian control, operating out of South Lebanon. Other terrorist groups, or groups which have been identified as terrorist groups, operating elsewhere in the region. The biggest problem in terms of public opinion here is that in many ways, although we have all watched the same event, the war, unfold, people in the Arab world have seen a very different reality than people even in Europe and certainly in North America have seen. What they have seen, what their newspapers, their television have focused on, have not been troop advancement, but civilian casualties and civilian pain. That is what is very much in the hearts of people here. They have seen these images, the terrible images of the brutality of war affecting Iraqi people, brother Arabs, and that sense of Arab brotherhood is a very real sense and a very strong sense. They feel that pain, they wonder what happens next, and yes, they may see Iraqis celebrating. They may themselves be no friends of Saddam Hussein and be very clearly aware of all the crimes of his past. But still, they fear very much for the future. They fear for American intentions, and it speaks in large measure to the lack of U.S. credibility in the region, that when people look at those pictures, they don't see images of liberation, they see a future occupation. Becky?
Sheila McVicker in Damascus, Syria. Stay with us. CNN's continuing coverage of the war in Iraq resumes after the break. We'll find out what's involved in getting aid to more than 26 million people. Stay with us.
What about Paris?
Why not the Caribbean?
How can planning your next trip be even better?
Mexico?
Knowing your trip could be free.
Hawaii!
Yes!
Call now to request the City Advantage World MasterCard, and you can earn free award travel plus get 8,000 bonus miles. And you can use your miles to fly on over 25 top airlines. You'll earn 1 mile for every $1 you spend on everyday purchases and on special purchases too. Call to request your card and 8,000 bonus miles. Plus, now your miles never expire as long as you make a purchase with your card at least once every 3 years. Soon, you'll be on the trip you plan. Use your miles to fly on over 25 top airlines, stay at the finest hotels worldwide, and drive with any major car rental company free. Call now to request your City Advantage World MasterCard and 8,000 bonus miles, and your next trip to almost anywhere could be free.
Welcome back to our continuing coverage of the war in Iraq. Here's a recap of the latest developments on day 22. In Baghdad, another day, another statue. Almost destroyed.
Well.
Apparently not enough explosive power, as only the middle portion of the Saddam Hussein likeness was blown away some 20 minutes ago by US troops. We're told the crowd gathered round, determined to stay there until it's completely destroyed. We're keeping an eye on developments for you there. Kurdish troops captured a village in northern Iraq on Wednesday, and coalition aircraft have launched their heaviest wave of bombing yet in the region, an effort to soften up Iraqi lines. Kurdish commanders tell CNN's Brent Sadler they expect to gain significant ground on Thursday as a result of those strikes. But on the northern front, planes have launched the heaviest wave of bombing on the region so far. That comes as the coalition targets northern cities still under regime control. For more, we're joined by CNN's Jane Araf. She's near Erbil in northern Iraq. Jane.
Becky, this morning for the first time we have seen actual tanks. Now, this has the population here very excited. This convoy of tanks, Abrams tanks, that main battlefield tank of the U.S. Army, as well as Bradley fighting vehicles and several hundred troops making their way to what's believed to be an airfield on the outskirts of Erbil. Now, the military commander, the unit commander for that convoy, tells us that there are more expected, more tanks, more troops, more heavy armor that will allow them to deploy to points further towards Mosul and Kirkuk. Right now, they're bringing that heavy equipment into an airfield, the Harir airfield, and they're airlifting these tanks for the first time. Now, these are 60-ton vehicles, and the unit commander tells us this is really the first time that they have done an airlift of this kind. They're assembling near the city of Erbil, and they will be moving out at some point after they have more tanks and more troops in force. Becky?
Jane, we've seen and heard significant bombing of the north of Iraq over the past couple of weeks. Does that seem to have ceased slightly, and should we expect that this ground offensive will now be the strategy going forward?
Certainly it gives them the capability, Becky, of a ground offensive if they want to do that. They've been hampered so far by two things, really. The lack of troops on the ground. These have been quite lightly armed airborne troops that were parachuted into that airfield in Harir. And the advances that we've seen all along the northern front line have been small numbers of U.S. Special Forces who have gone forward, a lot of times into areas that have been vacated by Iraqi troops who have been retreating towards Mosul and Kirkuk. There hasn't been a lot of active fighting along the northern front lines, mostly because the American troops seem to be under orders not to engage the Iraqis. They just have not had the manpower or the equipment. Now they do. There's also been a feeling that with the Kurds in place, they really don't want to let Kurdish forces get too far ahead to avoid antagonizing the Turks, who are still saying that they would send in Turkish troops into northern Iraq if they thought the circumstances warranted. But what this does, this deployment we're seeing today that's expected to continue for the next few days, gives the U.S. Army the ability to actually move in to those key cities, Mosul and Kirkuk. Becky?
And remind us, Jane, then, some context so far as northern Iraq is concerned. What's held by the coalition forces and what remains to be seized?
Well, here in the north, there's still quite a lot to be done, relatively speaking. Now, yesterday we were within 10 miles, 15 kilometers of Mosul after the U.S. forces took a strategic hill almost directly overlooking Mosul. Now, this is just an example of what's happening here. There's now nothing in between that mountain stronghold and the edge of the city, but the troops have not moved in. The U.S. troops have not moved in. They still do have to secure those cities, and especially the oil fields in Kirkuk. That does contain almost half of Iraq's oil, and it's still a priority. Becky?
Jane Araf in northern Iraq, thank you. Fanula.
Let's take a look now at the war's effect on Iraq's civilian population. Aid organizations warn that Iraqi civilians are facing a dire situation. The International Committee of the Red Cross says the main surgical hospitals are relying on backup generators for power. And the UN Population Fund says pregnant women are particularly at risk given the low medical supplies and the high patient load in hospitals. Aid officials also say they're worried about a lack of clean water. Power outages are stopping pumps, and the organization CARE says 4 years of drought and a neglected sewer system have led to a poor quality of water throughout the country. Officials say a lack of functioning sewage treatment plants means 500,000 tons of raw sewage are discharged into water supplies daily. The World Health Organization says the lack of a clean water supply in Baghdad makes surgeries in hospitals more of a threat.